Did you know that in the wealthiest country in the world, millions live below the poverty line? Yes, in America, over 37 million people are living in poverty. That's more than 11% of the population. Almost half of those living in poverty are children. Can you imagine that? Even with jobs, many Americans can't make ends meet. Minimum wage isn't enough to lift a family out of poverty. Single-parent households, especially those led by women, are more likely to experience poverty. Poverty affects rural areas just as much as urban ones. Rural America faces shocking levels of poverty too. Education is supposed to be the way out, but many poor children don't have access to quality education. We need to face these facts and work towards change. Everyone deserves a fair shot at the American dream.
Greetings and welcome back to this next installment of Bible Topics that make you say, hmm. And I'm Robin Sweet Ransom. And so you just saw the video, so you know what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about poverty. And I'm curious, do you know anyone who's living in poverty? Or do you only think of it as something that's happening in developing nations? And when you think of poverty, you think of pictures of starving, beautiful children such as this child. But as that video helped you to appreciate poverty exists here in America, you may have a neighbor who's in poverty, or you may believe that you are in poverty. Maybe you're not even making minimum wage, can't afford to live alone. You have to have a roommate or live with family. Why does poverty have a chokehold? Well, the reasons are multifaceted. We're going to jump into what aborigine.project.org says. It says the world already produces enough food to feed 10 billion people. What? Yes. Did that shock you? We already got enough food for pretty much everybody on the earth. And with desalination and water recycling technology, supplying safe drinking water to even the driest areas of the world is also possible with enough energy and money. Isn't it interesting that countries around the globe can afford money for war, but can't feed the poor? As Tupac said, got money for wars, but can't feed the poor. Things have not changed in the 30 years since he's been dead. It's still the situation today. Political systems that favor the wealthy do not have the interest of the working poor at heart. They just don't, for the most part. Corrupt governments, especially in developing nations, prevent aid from reaching those in need, especially where it's a war-torn area. Social structures sometimes prevent movement between the classes, like in India. The untouchables are prevented from moving up and changing their status in life. And even in this country, it can be hard for those in poverty or the working poor to progress into the middle class and even beyond. Historical exploitation of a country's resources have long-lasting effects, and oppression of a population leads to large income disparities. What is poverty? It says poverty may be described as an inability to secure minimum human needs concerning food, clothing, housing, clean water, education, and health. And if these minimum needs are not fulfilled, humans undergo pain and suffering, sickness, and most often, poverty is a situation that no one wants to live in. I won't say most often, every time people want to get out of it. That's one of the reasons why immigration is so high from developing nations to developed nations, because they're trying to get a better life. They want to flee the effects of poverty, being homeless, watching your children die because you can't feed them. But we know that poverty is a reality that has existed since the beginning of time almost. We know Adam and Eve weren't impoverished, but it began to be something that happened. And God holds certain people accountable. Proverbs 14:31 says, the one who oppresses the poor person does what? Insults his maker, insults Yahweh. But one who is kind to the needy honors Yahweh. Proverbs 22:16 goes on to say, oppressing the poor to enrich oneself and giving to the rich, both lead only to poverty. And there are the rich stealing from the poor and giving to their rich buddies. Robin Hood in reverse. You've got these leaders, especially in this country, wanting to not even tax the rich, but want to put all that burden on the poor. The rich are protected first by the police, by firefighters and everyone else, civil servants. But they don't want to pay their salaries. They don't want to pay taxes, and taxes helps to pay their salaries. They want to leave that to you and me. Amos 5:12 goes on to say, "For I know your crimes are more and many, and your sins are innumerable. They oppress the righteous, take a bribe, and deprive the poor of justice at the city gates." This happens not only in developing nations, it happens here. No matter who's in office, the cycle of poverty continues, and the cycle of rape of the poor continues. But God has something in store for us. Trouble won't last always, as a gospel song says. Poverty won't last always. Isaiah 65:17 through 19 and 21 through 23 promises us, "For I," God says this, "will create a new heavens and a new earth. Our past events will not be remembered or come to mind. Then be glad and rejoice forever in what I am creating. For I will create Jerusalem to be a joy and its people to be a delight. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad in my people. The sound of weeping and crying will no longer be heard in her. People will build houses and live in them. They will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They will not build and others live in them. They will not plant and others eat," which is happening today. One of the forms of human trafficking has to do with people being trafficked for their labor, not being paid. Modern day slavery. God will put an end to that. "For my people's lives will be like the lifetime of a tree. My chosen ones will fully enjoy the work of their hands. They will not labor without success or bear children destined for disaster," like that beautiful child we saw at the beginning of this video. "For they will be a people blessed by the Lord along with their descendants." This is what God is promising us. So why does poverty have a chokehold? Greedy leaders and nations oppress the people. Yes, it can be people's own fault. Sometimes, if you get hooked on drugs, you lose your job, you end up homeless, can't feed yourself, can't feed your children, that's on you. But that is not the only reason. I wish it were that simple. Then we could just wash our hands of the situation, right? No, it's deeper than that. Rich countries take advantage of developing nations, and America is chief among them. It behaves as a savior on one hand and as a devil on the other. America is a part of those countries that rape developing nations for their resources. Africa, as a continent, is one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest continent on the face of the earth. I would say it's the wealthiest, but it has 54 countries. Most of their average citizens live in poverty. Why is that? It's not because they don't have the resources, they do. It's because of their corrupt leaders, as well as other developing nations raping them of their resources, pitting the people against each other for them to war against one another and not fight the enemy, trying to rape them while also giving them handouts. Speaking of handouts, it says rich countries often give financial aid to poor countries, but it does not solve the poverty. Why not? So rich countries should give other types of help to the poor countries rather than just the financial aid. Do you believe or agree with that? We've heard the saying, teach a man, give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. Teach a man two fish, he'll eat for a lifetime. We need to stand out, get out of their way and trying to help themselves while we're helping them. But you know what? It breaks God's heart that the wealth gap has grown exponentially with the poor suffering around the globe. But Jesus will exact an accounting from the greedy. So be careful how you treat the poor. Remember, Jesus was poor and he's watching. Ultimately, though, no matter what the government's endeavor to do, and I will say that the American government has tried to help its own citizens, but ultimately only Christ will permanently end poverty. And we see here people marching in the Poor People's Campaign. It is said that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was murdered not because he was fighting for civil rights. It was when he was starting to unite the poor, regardless of racial differences, that got him killed. They didn't want all of the poor to unite and ask for things. No, they didn't want that. And in this book, it answers the question how rich countries get rich and why poor countries stay poor. Well, you know what? God does have the answer. He has a plan to end world poverty. And we're reminded in Isaiah 65:17-23 that his plan is to create a new heavens and new earth, and he's going to wipe out all that we see today, and we will not labor without success or bear children destined for disaster. He promises this. So if you want to get there to see a world when it's like that, accept Jesus' invitation in Romans 10:9-13. If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Take him at his word. All right, see you next time on Bible Topics that make you say, and do what you can to help those in need and help them to break the chokehold of poverty where you can.